Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of our metaphysics unit. Here in Philosophy 101, we will be studying today the philosophy, the epistemology, the metaphysical theories of David Hume, the important empiricist philosopher. So just some context. David Hume was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was a Scottish philosopher. David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, that is. Hume is well known for his treatise of human nature. He is well known for his inquiry concerning human understanding, which is it's really a condensed version of his treatise on human nature. And he's now considered to be one of the big three British empiricists, and the one, to quote Bertrand Russell, who brought empiricism to its logical conclusion. That is because the empiricists who came before him, so that would be John Locke and Berkeley, whom we investigated in part 1, and then of course Locke in part 2, those thinkers were really scratching at the surface of empiricism. Berkeley we now consider to be an idealist, which is basically a form of hard empiricism. Locke was an empiricist, and Hume is really refining a lot of Locke's ideas and making them more intelligible and hopefully more scientific. Hume was attempting to develop a science of the mind. He was an excellent prose writer. He wrote in clear, concise, uncluttered language, and he's famous for this quotation that we philosophers like to bandy about, which is that the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. That sounds strange, right? And we'll investigate that a little bit later. He's also famous for saying that reason is actually, if you consider human nature, reason is actually a slave of the passions. We like to think that we're very rational human beings, that we make rational decisions, that our politics are based on rational ideas and principles that we hold. David Hume's point was that actually no, we are a very emotionally oriented species. Our human nature dictates that reason is a slave of the passions, that we can use reason, but what we typically use reason to do is to defend our emotional gut instincts. So we engage in confirmation bias. We engage in what the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls motivated reasoning. So we, at a pre-rational sort of gut intuitive level, we decide what we believe, and then we go out in search of reasons, and we use our reason to defend what we already believed at a pre-rational gut intuitive level. And so that's kind of a cynical look at human nature, but nevertheless one that's held up well, stood the test of time. Oh, this is a picture of me in Scotland at the statue in Edinburgh of David Hume. Okay, so let's start with Hume's philosophy, and we're going to be studying his philosophy of perception and his epistemology here. So what Hume does is he simplifies Locke's ideas. And he says, look, Locke, your ideas are great, but they're too convoluted, right? Let's just break it down in a simple fashion. There are two types of perceptions. There are impressions. Those are like Locke's sensations. And there are ideas. So impressions are the immediate sensations of external reality that we have, or the immediate and original contents of our own psychological states. So our impressions can be broken down in two ways. One, it's a sensation that you have in the external world, right? You touch something, it's hot. That's a simple sensation, as Locke would have called it. That's an impression. You have a sensory impression, according to Hume. And then another type of impression that you can have is like an immediate feeling that you have, right? So I'm going to quote Hume here. Impressions are our more lively perceptions when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. Okay? And so our original experiences, whether they're internal, immediate, just feelings that wash over us like hate, or the perception that something is, yellow, right? Those are impressions, right? Seeing yellow, feeling hate, those are instant impressions, and they're of two different kinds, right? So one's the contents of our own psychological states. One is just an immediate external sensation, but those are impressions. Ideas, on the other hand, are the recollections that you have of such impressions after the fact. So the example I like to use here is that if you burn yourself on a hot oven, you get an immediate impression, obviously, right? You feel hot, right? And you could even think in your mind, ouch, hot, ouch, ouch, right? You feel pain immediately. Now, that's the impression. The recollection after the fact is the idea. So the following day, you call to mind the experience that you had of doing what you did. That's an idea, right? So we receive the impression of a tree, we see it immediately, right? And then we can recollect the idea of a tree in our mind, right? Which is the recollection of the original impression we had of the tree. So recollections are, according to Hume's philosophy, weaker than impressions, obviously, because impressions are immediate, right? So it's an impression when we experience the taste of oysters, right? So you taste the taste of oysters, that's an impression. And it's an idea when we recall it months later, and we can actually call to mind what that flavor tasted like. That's an idea of it. Okay, so the experience of anger is an impression, but the thought of yesterday's anger is an idea. So I hope that that's clear. Okay, so impressions versus ideas. As we said, the impression is stronger and livelier than your reflective memory of that impression. The sensation or impression is the original. The idea or reflection is only a pale imitation. The sensation is the direct cause of the idea stored in the mind. Right? So all ideas, and this is what makes Hume an empiricist, can be traced back to original impressions. Okay? Again, what makes him an empiricist is this belief that all knowledge comes from the senses. That when you have a complex idea like honor or democracy or a nation state or the world community or NATO or the McDonald's Corporation, just think of an actual complex idea. All those start from the original building blocks of those complex ideas are simple impressions. A lot of people don't think about it that way. And what we do then is the way that we combine simple impressions and turn them into complex ideas. And this should remind you a lot of Locke's philosophy from the last lecture. What we do is we combine them through, and this is Hume's original contribution, through resemblance, right? So for example, resemblance, we put our impression of two different trees together into one category of tree. So that when you're sitting in a crowd and I'm performing on stage and I say, all right, audience, I want you to think of a tree, right? We'll all simultaneously start thinking of a tree. It might look different in each of our minds, right? But since we all share the abstraction of tree, all of our thoughts, when I, the performer, ask you to think of a tree in your mind, all the trees in the audience are going to have something in common. They're all going to have a certain kind of treeness, right? And that comes from our experience of seeing a bunch of different trees, realizing what they all have in common, and ignoring what they have in terms of differences. Another thing that we do to turn simple impressions into complex ideas is contiguity. So the principle of contiguity describes the tendency of ideas to become associated if the objects they represent are near to each other in time or space, and this includes things like cause and effect, right? Things that are close in physical context. So if you have a tree, for example, and you notice that birds constantly perch in trees and build their nest in trees, that will change your perception of what a tree is for, what it does. That will also change your perception of what a bird is, where birds go, what they do, how they nest, etc. Okay, so I'm going to actually read you a quote here from the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding by Hume. Quote, "The creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experiences." Okay, so the big thing here to keep in mind, and here's an actual chart of this, a pretty nice image of this. And of course, you have ideas, feeble, cold copies of what were once impressions, and then impressions, the direct and vivid products of immediate sensory experience. And you can see here in the middle that we turn impressions into complex ideas through association. And that's what Hume's talking about, right? And so without the original impressions, the mind can have no real content. And that's what makes Hume an empiricist, right? Is that that knowledge and ideas and principles are derived from experience, right? So a man who's blind from birth can have no idea of what red means, and a man who is deaf from birth has no notion of what a sound is like, right? And so Hume's point is, look, of course, like it actually goes back to a point that Descartes made, which was Descartes said, look, if you try to create your own fantasy creature, right? Let's say you're a fantasy novelist and you want to create some unique animal that doesn't actually exist in the real world. Descartes says that's fine, and you can create an original made-up animal, and that's a lot of fun, but just admit the fact that you're building that animal out of direct sensations and impressions that you have. So you can't use but what you know to create that animal. So while you may have come up with an interesting new creature for your fantasy novel, it's definitely going to be based on the parts and features and characteristics and qualities of animals that exist in the real world. It can't be otherwise. And so to just break this down even more simply, there's a nice little chart here that I want you to look at. Because Hume breaks it down even further. And here we're really getting a sense, and this is why Hume's popular in psychology too, because his model of perception is actually really interesting and a lot of people think quite accurate, especially for the time that it was written. So there are simple impressions and complex impressions. There are simple ideas and complex ideas. So Hume makes it really simple for us, simplifies everything that Locke said. Okay, so take a look at this apple right here. You're a baby, you don't understand abstractions or concepts or language, but you do experience this thing out there in the world. You come into contact with it and you perceive it. And what you experience, before you even know that it's a concrete object that we call an apple, you experience the hardness, the greenness, the round shape, the tartness when you bite into it, right? Those are simple impressions. Touching the hardness, seeing the greenness, right? Running your hand over it and seeing its round shape, biting into it and feeling the acidity or whatever, right? That's a simple impression. So think Locke. That's our most basic building block of knowledge and perception. Okay, now, once you've seen enough of them, once you've done that thing, the association, right? Once you link these things through sensation, you eventually come to develop the complex idea of an apple, and then henceforth you can have a complex impression, right? So when I see an apple, someone puts an apple in front of my face, I go, that's an apple. I know what an apple looks like. I can have a complex impression of an apple. Before I knew what an apple was, I could only have simple impressions. There's just this thing in front of me that's hard. Oh, experience that. Round, experience that. Tart, whatever. Now I can look and see apple. Apple, 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 apple. I can go to a farm and I can see a bunch of barnyard animals and I can pick out horse, 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 horse. I can pick out all the horses, right? Okay, so now there are ideas. Remember, ideas are the recollection of your experiences, right? So they're not the experience itself. So there are simple ideas and complex ideas. A simple idea would be something like recollection of the experience you had of the apple's hardness, greenness, roundness, tartness. You can do that. I can think of what it feels like to bite into a Granny Smith apple. That is a simple idea. I'm having it right now of tartness and what that feels like in my mouth. Okay? I can imagine touching the smoothness of a Granny Smith apple. I can picture what that feels like. I'm calling up a recollection. Now, a complex idea, okay, is a recollection of the experience of the apple, right? So while simple impressions are the most vivid, complex ideas have sort of lost their vividness, okay? So simple impressions, simple ideas, complex ideas. That would be the thought I can call up in my mind of an apple. I can think of a Granny Smith apple, I can think of a Macintosh apple. I can do that in my mind, but they both share a certain appleness. They're both going to share qualities. I can call that to mind. The picture of an abstract apple, I can do that. That's a complex idea. And the cool thing about Hume's philosophy is you can sit there while you're learning it and try this in your mind, and you realize he's kind of right. Okay, so what does this all mean? Just really briefly, right? Just to give you a context of the categories in philosophy. Empiricism, right? Locke and Hume are empiricists. You might even call Berkeley a hard empiricist, right? He takes it to the extreme, right? Empiricism dictates that impressions have priority in order of knowledge. So all knowledge that you're going to have, all of your big fancy ideas are going to be built of these simple basic building blocks, right? So, and of course, you make the ideas that you have. So take a dog, for example, right? If you have the impression of, the complex impression of a dog, the corresponding idea of the dog that you have can be made more complex by adding the idea of new things about the dog that you didn't know before. So if you'd always been kept really far away from dogs who never bark, you would not be able to add the smell of a dog or the sound of a dog barking to dogness, right? And so the more simple impressions you have, the more complex your idea of a concept or a thing can become. And that should give you a really, that should give you a really good sense of how exactly simple impressions build up to become complex ideas. And of course, Hume's point all along is that knowledge, although we don't like to think so, we like to think that our abstract idea of a dog is just this abstract idea floating in the nether regions of our mind, of our knowledge, but it's actually, it all comes back to simple impressions, right? So the concept dog doesn't correspond to any single dog. When we abstract, what we do is we ignore certain specific features and concentrate on others. So to develop the concept of dog, we ignore the different colors and different sizes that dogs can be, that can come in, and we pick out other features that they all have, like 4 legs, a tail, a bark, that they're hairy, etc. Right? Now, of course, to be scientific and less metaphysical and epistemological, of course, you're going to be a scientist. And originally, in Hume's age, you would have used the Linnaean system of classification. Now we use the phylogenetic, but in terms of the basic model of perception and in terms of philosophy, this is a really good model for how perception works. So then ideas are feeble and derivative copies. And the important thing is that if we can trace an idea back to its corresponding impression, then its credentials are validated. Right? So this is actually going to come down to a critical thinking point here. That and this is what Hume believed, and I'm going to give you the quote here, but his point was that any intellectual term or abstraction that wasn't originally tied to direct impressions, those things could be tossed out. They were empty and useless. They weren't based on reality. So Hume says, quote, "When we entertain any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived. And if it be impossible to assign any, this will confirm our suspicion that the idea is bunk." And so, great, right. So you can get a sense of this if you... So here's a point that I want to make, and I'm going to make this one last point, and then I'm going to sign off because I don't want the video to go on too long. Hume also made the point that it is not the case that complex ideas that you have must be copies of actual impressions, right? It is only simple ideas that are copies of impressions, okay? You can actually, and here's the reason why, you can actually make up false complex ideas. But all complex ideas, false or true, are composed of simple impressions and simple ideas. So take the unicorn, right? This is actually quite easy to see in the case of unicorns. We have experiences of horses, horns, whiteness. If you put them together, right, you get a unicorn, right? So the unicorn is based on simple impressions, right? The type of fur it has, the type of mane a horse has. You've seen a horse's snout before. You've seen a narwhal's tusk before, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of simple and complex impressions that you have that you put together to create something false, right? You put those things together, you get a unicorn, but you've actually never had the complex impression of a real unicorn out there in the world because they don't exist, right? So all Hume is saying is that this gives us a kind of critical thinking model, is that we can take an idea, we can break it down all the way down to its simple impressions, and we can go through that process and we can determine the validity of the concept that we're discussing. Okay, I did not expect to ramble this long. Next lecture, so I might have to break this into 5 lectures. Next lecture, we're going to talk about the distinction between a priori and a posteriori propositions, what Hume called probable statements and demonstrative statements. And we'll go into that in the next video. The next video will probably be pretty short, so we'll talk in the next video about the difference between what it means for something to be an a priori truth versus an a posteriori truth, versus things like anthropocentric truths, so truths that are true because of the kinds of creatures we are. But we're going to stop there because that is 22.5 minutes of a difficult philosophy, and I will see you for the next lecture, lecture number 4, and the 5th lecture then will have to be the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who really brings everything together, synthesizes and fuses rationalism and empiricism, and is really the most modern, most sort of well-respected, in line with scientific thinking model of perception and knowledge that we have. Thank you.